Red Dead Redemption 2 stands as one of the finest looking games released this console generation. Sporting Rockstar's latest technology, it delivers a massive open world environment with gorgeous sunsets and massive vistas. But that doesn't mean there aren't flaws. Since its launch, users have suggested that there have been downgrades made to some of the visuals. We already know that the HDR is poorly implemented, and what about the PlayStation 4 Pro's checkerboard rendering solution? Well, I thought we'd step back and take a look at the state of Red Dead Redemption 2 in 2019. Have any of these issues been corrected? According to the latest patch notes, a lot of them have been touched, but does it really live up to expectations? To discuss this though, I am joined by Tom Morgan.
How's it going?
Pretty good, Tom. For this video then, we're going to break this down into 3 different sections. We're going to start by analyzing the HDR modes added in the latest patch. Then we'll follow that up with a look at the checkerboard rendering on PS4 Pro just to see if it's improved, and of course, we'll discuss the rumored downgrades. But let's kick off with HDR.
Yeah, so lots to tackle there for sure, and I think obviously the priority is that HDR issue. Following on from our Digital Foundry Best HDR Showcases video, there was one game that was on the tip of our tongues as the most disappointing use of the technology, and Red Dead Redemption 2 was that game. It didn't deliver what we expected at launch. Rockstar's support was essentially an 8-bit SDR picture, tone mapped and held in a 10-bit HDR container, so it did very little for people with compatible displays. But today, well, that's very much changed. A new and improved patch is in our hands this week, but just to what extent does it fix the HDR mode, and what's the difference between the cinematic and game modes in that calibration menu? So to dig deeper, I've invited a special guest, Adam Fairclough, also known as Evil Boris, who wrote a Digital Foundry piece for us on this very subject. So welcome, Adam.
Hello, how you doing?
Yeah, very good. I'm so pleased you're on board because you really know your stuff. You've got the ability to look at a heat map view of the game, kind of to show us whether it's true HDR or not, which is the crux of the issue with the game at launch. Where to begin? I mean, you've tried it, did you like it? How's it turned out for you?
Yeah, so having a look at the game when the patch dropped just the other day, we can immediately see some really big changes, and they're good changes. I think that's the first thing to say. The improvements that have been made are very distinctly improvements. And we've obviously got these 2 new modes now. We've got a cinematic mode and we have this game mode, and both of these modes perform quite differently. What are your kind of experiences?
Yeah, so I do also feel that it's a massive improvement from the original. I mean, the tone-mapped SDR image into HDR space was arguably worse than just playing the game in SDR originally, I felt. For such a large budget game, it's a little bit surprising to have seen that implementation there. And it's immediately evident switching over to this that you got the highlights that really pop. It feels like there's a decent amount of contrast now between those highlights and the darker areas of the image. And I think you've actually done some nice heat maps for this as well, Adam, which we'll take a look at in a second. But I think I'm also curious to hear what Tom's thoughts are on this, because you didn't get a chance to play it in the original mode, but you recently picked up an OLED TV for your home as well. So what do you think?
It's one of the best uses of it. I switched it on, obviously no previous context, and the cinematic mode was the default setting. And to be honest, my first reaction was, wow, this doesn't look as impressive as I thought it might. Playing that game in even SDR, it looks incredible on an OLED, no matter what you play it on, it looks amazing. So I was expecting to be doubly blown away when I switched this HDR mode on. Fortunately, when you boot that and you go into the calibration settings, you've got that game mode, which unlocks the peak brightness setting for tweaking as you please. You can really go to town and adjust it to your TV, and that's what I did, and in the end I adjusted it quite a bit. It kind of defaults at that 1000 value. I ended up at 3200 going by the calibration, and I tweaked the paper white as well by a small amount to 160. It looks stunning. Outdoors in broad daylight, incredible, and especially in saloons, you're looking through those windows and you can see streaks of light, you can see that peak brightness coming through, and you get that really great definition in the sun, which is always the telltale sign of decent HDR mapping, that you can make the definition out between clouds.
Looking at those 2 modes, that cinematic mode is pretty much the same as it was at launch. So that is still our baseline SDR image, if we want to call it that. When I had a look at this, we can still see that essentially the peak white is attached to the paper white when playing in cinematic mode. So you're essentially just moving the brightest point of the SDR image up to the brightest point of what you choose for paper white. So this was the initial problem that we had, and in doing so, this raised the blacks a little bit and maybe give us an image that doesn't quite look right. Another thing that we saw as well at launch with the original HDR mode, this cinematic mode, was that there's a really significant difference in terms of how the image looks versus turning off the HDR altogether. Primarily, the things that people really noticed was very, very desaturated by comparison to the SDR mode, so it looks at times like a different game. And this is really evident even in the intro sequence to the game, where I play that in SDR and it's very distinctly dark and it's navy blue and it's bright orange from the flames, and switch it over into HDR mode and we see that this is incredibly different.
Yeah, so obviously I think the cinema mode is, we discussed that briefly, but that's the old stuff. The game mode is where things have changed, and this is where the HDR implementation becomes much more effective. And you've produced some nice heat maps for this, Adam. What are your thoughts then, comparatively?
First things I could really notice when you go out into the world and we have got these naturalistic lighting situations. We've got the sunsets, the sunrises, you've got storms, we've got lightning, we've got the fog. We can really see the sun is very clearly defined now. We don't have that bloomy haze that we typically have in the cinematic mode. That's really clear and defined, and also very bright as well. What we could actually see that I found quite interesting was that the sun, which as a rule of thumb is likely to be the very brightest thing in any game, actually never achieves that peak brightness. When I look at some of the data behind the scenes, I can see that even if you've got the peak brightness up to 10,000 nits, it's about 10% short. And when I say about 10% short, almost exactly 10% short of the peak brightness. Now, another thing that we could see as well is in those situations when you're outside and it's daytime typically as well, at the other end of the scale, at the sort of darker parts of the image, we're about 10% away from the very darkest part of the histogram. So actually things are raised about 10% away from pure black. In my mind, this kind of points to there's some kind of setup there for the way that the game is handling the exposure of the image, or grading the image, or toning the image, whatever we want to call it, that's creating this little bit of compression at either end of the image. And this kind of makes sense, especially when we think about the game in the context of being this very, cinematic piece. One of the ways that a game is typically given a cinematic kind of color grade is to compress highlights a little bit and raise blacks a little bit as well. That's a fairly common thing, and I do wonder if some of that exposure difference that we're seeing is a kind of throwback to the way the game has been designed to look.
I'd like to talk to the artists about this to understand their vision for the color grading here. And when you combine that with the reliance on, they do a lot of eye adaptation in this game. So like as you move and transition between different areas, they're constantly making adjustments to sort of simulate your pupils opening and closing, which is not an uncommon thing, but it's rather extreme in this game, I feel, which is part of the look, I suppose. Depending on how this was artistically engineered from the beginning, I can see why they would have made these choices. I think honestly though, the summary here is that they basically have corrected it, but it still sort of retains their original vision for the look of the game. It does deliver a more acceptable HDR experience that you would expect from a game like this now, but you have to make sure you use the game mode. So
whether or not you're playing in HDR cinematic mode or in game mode, if you do flick back to SDR, there's still a really massive difference in terms of color and saturation, and there'll still be people that prefer that look. It's still not quite right, and I do genuinely think that this is just kind of leftover stuff from the game having a basis as an SDR experience. I think what developers are tending to do now is they're building their games with HDR displays in mind, and all of the color grading and all of the exposure and everything is set up for that as the first port of call, and then the SDR displays actually come afterwards, so they simply tone map it down to that lower value. But I suspect this game, because of when it was made and how long it was being made for, they haven't considered those HDR displays until very near the end.
I suppose the last few questions are, is there any kind of preferred setting, Adam, that you suggest to people? Sort of a few tips to get the most out of it, supposing they have an OLED or even a high-end LED display supporting HDR?
Yes and no. We've obviously got those two settings there. We've got that peak brightness setting. Ultimately, we want to move that as high as you can do for your, that's kind of appropriate for your display and the way that your display actually performs its own tone mapping or display mapping. So you can just follow those instructions there, move that peak brightness adjustment up to the point where the Rockstar logo is no longer visible and it becomes exactly the same level of white. What you can potentially do is you can go a little bit higher than that because the exposure seems to be actually falling slightly short of that peak brightness in many situations anyway. One of the times that we do actually see the exposure behaving differently is actually when we are in an interior. So although when we seem to be outside on a sunny day, the blacks seem to be a little bit more raised and the highlights seem to be pulled back a little bit. If you do walk into an interior, we do actually hit very black blacks and we do actually hit very bright whites, and that's actually going to be the only point you see the peak brightness inside a dark environment rather than see it on the sun or in a light source somewhere else in the game.
The big question really is, would you rather play this game this way or the way it was originally intended and calibrated in the SDR space? For me, having actually not played very much of Red Dead Redemption 2, I think I would. I feel like I would be missing out, but at the same time I'm still bugged a little bit by the levels, especially the black levels in certain scenes in game mode. Yeah, I would go with HDR, but throw it out to you guys. Would you play with HDR enabled if you're going to do a fresh playthrough, Adam?
Yes, I would. When you're out and about in that world, it looks incredible. I mean, it's an incredible looking game anyway, but the addition of your display being able to hit those very, very bright levels from the sun, from the sky, from the sun reflecting off snow, or specular highlights on water, on other materials, really, really looks amazing. Even in just the short time that I've spent with it, it brings a genuine smile to my face when we see it happening. It looks fantastic. I would play it like that. I suppose if you're really bothered by the decrease in saturation, I know it's not an ideal solution, but you could turn it up a little bit on your TV, maybe to mitigate it a bit.
Yeah, and I generally agree with Adam on this. I mean, I think it definitely looks better in HDR. That's definitely the way that I would continue to play. And since I haven't actually finished the story yet, due to its insane length and so many other games to play, I might jump back in and give it a shot. But I think we've talked about HDR quite a bit already, so thanks for joining us on this section, Adam.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, with the HDR out of the way and that nice chat there with Adam, it's time to talk about Ambient Occlusion. And this is an interesting one, specifically because a couple months ago there was a patch that supposedly changed the way this works, leading people to speculate that the game was downgraded. But I wasn't fully on board with that, and I think that there was just a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding about what's going on, and sometimes people perceive a change as worse, even if it's not actually worse. But just to be sure, we've got a lot of different footage from the very first off the disc version up through the most recent patch. And Tom, what did you find in gathering that footage?
Put it bluntly, on the latest HDR patch, the ambient occlusion shade between objects is much better than it was, for example, than on day one without a patch, just playing from the disc. And so that was really my first pop call, regardless of what happened in between. How does it compare to what we had on day one? And to do this, it's been a bit of a challenge, to be honest, because ambient occlusion, as you know, John, is a very fine detail. And so to get a good example, we have to match the time of day and the weather in this game to a T.
This is critical because one of the shots being passed around everywhere was the saloon here, and quite frankly, like matching up exact times of day is almost impossible due to the not just time of day, but the actual weather conditions and just the way the game works. So the lighting conditions can vary a lot. That actually confused a lot of people. But if you step back from the time of day thing and look at a scene from the introduction here that is locked in terms of time of day and weather conditions, then you can actually see the impact that it has. And I actually think the results here are kind of interesting, and I think it looks better now than it did originally. They've actually refined the effect.
Yeah, I agree. We're looking at points in the corner, around the player's clothing, around their neck, where ambient shade will appear. The first comparison I did was against the original 0 patch versus the HDR patch, and there's basically more shade than there was before, and this is exactly matched time of day and all that. So
that bit I saw there around the barrel, in fact, that was like the most noticeable, because you can see a little bit of shadowing from the rim of the barrel that's in the HDR patch that's kind of absent in the original. So in that sense, it's actually more accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And to put it into context, we also had a record of the patch just before this HDR patch, just to see, okay, so what's the difference? And it turns out this latest patch did improve it. It made it more refined. So before and after 1.09, there's finer gradients of shade, and you can see it's slightly more refined version. There are many types of ambient occlusion out there. There's screen space ambient occlusion, horizon based, and there's variants of those each. I'm not clear what it is Rockstar have changed to and what they've changed from. It may come down to a matter of opinion, but for my money, this does look better. It's looked the best it's ever been.
Yeah, and that's what's weird. I guess you could say it seems like it actually has changed multiple times, whereas, you know, the initial on-disc version looks different from the patches that would follow, which also look different than the most recent patch. And sometimes the changes feel really subtle, but it does look a tad different overall. I think the point is that as it is now, it's actually better, and I am fascinated actually that they've continued to optimize.
Yeah, actually there are some parallels with the parallax occlusion mapping change in Grand Theft Auto 5. Simply put, it was removed in one patch and then reinstated in the next. We can assume it was more or less a mistake because it didn't really affect performance in any way. It's still 30 FPS, it didn't really affect that.
And I think then we can talk about our last point here, and this is perhaps the quickest one of all, and that is checkerboard rendering on PlayStation 4. When I first looked at the game, I found the implementation somewhat lacking. There's different ways to do checkerboard rendering and how you resolve the final image, and in the case of Red Dead 2, with all its foliage, it kind of gives you the impression where you're missing resolution on half of it, if you will, like half the image. So it creates this like double step effect on certain pixels that is somewhat, it's not great, and it's pretty noticeable on some objects. You finally did a side-by-side with the latest version on Pro versus the older builds. What did you find?
It's exactly the same. In terms of the artifacting with the double width pixels on the horizontal axis, it's just the same. You can look at certain points of the image which reveal it more obviously, like the reins of the horse. You can see these fine elements overlapping and swaying between each other, and that really highlights, okay, there's the stair-stepping and there's a slight artifacting, the banding. I'm going to zoom in here in the video just to show like the disc version without a patch, and today it's pretty much the same.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, checkerboard rendering is kind of a hit or miss thing anyway. Some implementations look suitably close to 4K, others don't quite get there, so I think that's pretty much it. The HDR is great now. It's hugely improved. Ambient occlusion is better than it's ever been, and checkerboard rendering is the same.
I think overall this comes as good news though. We've got an overall improvement, and it shows Rockstar's really still invested in making this game better over incremental patches. But I suppose that hits all the nails on the head for today. Thanks so much for joining me, John.
Oh, but of course, Tom.
And if you did like this look at Red Dead Redemption 2 and want to see more coverage, please feel free to like or even subscribe to our channel to support what we do at Digital Foundry. And to get notifications as any videos arrive, just hit the bell. To get this video at its source file quality, be sure to check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with me, John, or the team, just use Twitter. But from all of us, thanks for watching.